In the Second World War, there were individuals for whom a single right or wrong decision was enough to change the fate of all Europe. Beyond Hitler or Stalin, there was another name standing at the center of those life and death choices. He was the supreme commander of the Allied forces, directly overseeing decisive campaigns such as Torch in North Africa and Overlord in Normandy. That man was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Not remembered for charging at the front lines, Eisenhower is known as the leader who bound nations together, coordinated millions of soldiers, and opened the door to the collapse of Nazi Germany. It was through his decisions that the course of the war and the shape of the post-war world was ultimately defined. By the late 1930s, the world was sinking into the darkness of a war that was spreading beyond control. In Europe, Adolf Hitler steadily shattered the post-World War I order with tanks, aircraft, and blitzkrieg warfare. Poland was crushed within weeks, and France, once the dominant continental power, collapsed in 1940. By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany turned its spear eastward, launching an invasion of the Soviet Union with the ambition of destroying its greatest rival in a single campaign. At the same time, in the Asia-Pacific region, Imperial Japan was expanding by force, conquering China, Southeast Asia, and increasingly challenging Western interests. In this context, the United States attempted to maintain a stance of neutrality, shaped both by the lingering trauma of World War I and by the strong isolationist sentiment within American society. Yet that neutrality grew ever more fragile as war spread across both hemispheres and global trade routes came under threat. On the 7th of December 1941, when Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, any remaining illusion that Washington could stay out of the conflict collapsed. The world had entered a new phase, in which fascism was no longer a problem confined to Europe or Asia, but a global threat. Faced with this danger, the anti-fascist powers, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and later Free France, were compelled to set aside political differences and form an unprecedented alliance, united by a single objective: to halt the domination of the Axis powers and salvage a world order on the brink of collapse. At that time, Eisenhower, of humble origins and a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1915, rose to prominence through his exceptional ability to organize and coordinate vast multinational forces. He was not a charismatic general known for stirring speeches, but rather for his calm demeanor, firm resolve, and relentless demand for results. For this reason, he was entrusted with the most critical missions at moments when the fate of the Allied nations hung in the balance. Eisenhower even drafted a statement in advance in case D-Day failed, taking full responsibility upon himself, an act that reflected his extraordinary sense of accountability. By 1944, Eisenhower was promoted to the rank of 5-star General of the Army, the highest rank in the U.S. Army at the time, and earned the deep respect of Allied leaders such as Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. The victories achieved under his command not only liberated Europe but also cemented the United States' position as a global superpower. While Eisenhower himself continued to exert profound influence in the post-war era, particularly during his presidency from 1953 to 1961. Eisenhower's path from a staff officer to a field commander did not follow the familiar step-by-step progression. It was abruptly reshaped by war. Operation Torch, the North African landings of November 1942, became his first true test and a life-or-death turning point in Dwight D. Eisenhower's command career. Before daring to strike directly at the European continent, the Allies were forced to find a safer indirect route to bring the U.S. Army into full-scale combat in North Africa, then under the control of Vichy France, emerged as an unavoidable choice. On the 8th of November 1942, Allied forces from the United States, Britain, and Canada simultaneously landed along the North African coast, launching Operation Torch. From his headquarters in London, Eisenhower, then Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, personally approved a bold and highly risky plan: to strike 3 objectives hundreds of kilometers apart at the same time: Casablanca in the west, Oran in the center, and Algiers in the east. The aim was to seize key ports, before the enemy could organize an effective response, then immediately drive toward Tunis to link up with the British Eighth Army advancing from Egypt. From the very first hours, Eisenhower confronted the harsh realities of coalition warfare. Poor weather disrupted many landings, while the response of Vichy French forces proved far less uniform than initial estimates. At Casablanca, French units resisted fiercely, using coastal artillery and warships to pin down U.S. forces for days. Eisenhower was forced to authorize Allied naval forces to close inshore and apply heavy firepower to break the defenses, accepting the risk of substantial losses in order to secure this vital naval base. At Oran, as British warships poured heavy fire onto the coastal defenses, Eisenhower placed speed above caution, pressing frontline commanders to strike quickly and denying Vichy forces the time to consolidate. At Algiers, where he had expected the least resistance, the situation unfolded almost exactly as anticipated. The French fleet laid down its arms on the first day, and only hours later, Vice Admiral François Darlan, a powerful figure of the Vichy regime present in the city, ordered a ceasefire across the entire region in exchange for retaining administrative control. It was a swift military success, but one that confronted Eisenhower with a deeply controversial political decision. Throughout the campaign, Eisenhower had to coordinate a massive force, around 100,000 American troops, more than 60,000 British soldiers, along with the U.S. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Armored Divisions, while dealing with an opponent whose morale was divided, yet still possessed coastal artillery, warships, and German-supplied anti-tank weapons. Allied advantages in organization, logistics, and firepower gradually came into play. But Torch also quickly exposed the fatal weaknesses of the still inexperienced U.S. Army. As the fighting pushed deep into Tunisia, Eisenhower realized that his command apparatus was not sharp enough. His delay in replacing Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the U.S. Econ Corps, led to the disastrous defeat at Kasserine Pass, where German counterattacks shattered inexperienced American units. It was Eisenhower's first direct shock in his role as Supreme Commander. It was precisely at that moment that Eisenhower's true character became most evident. He did not evade responsibility or shift blame onto subordinates or circumstances. Instead, Eisenhower swiftly overhauled the command structure, changed the way forces were employed, strengthened coordination among infantry, armor, and air power, and placed tougher, more capable officers in key positions. Within a few months, the transformation was unmistakable. From February to May 1943, Allied forces launched the Tunisia campaign, steadily tightening the noose around Axis forces. The outcome was decisive. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian troops in North Africa were forced to surrender, one of the Axis powers' greatest defeats since the beginning of the war. Operation Torch was not only a successful amphibious campaign, it also marked the first major breakthrough of the U.S. Army on the European continent, altering the balance of power in the Mediterranean and opening the way for subsequent offensives against Sicily and then the Italian mainland. Only a few months after securing victory in North Africa, Dwight D. Eisenhower pushed Allied forces in a new direction, toward the Italian peninsula, a key ally of Nazi Germany. On the 9th of July, 1943, Operation Husky was officially launched with the objective of seizing the island of Sicily and severing Europe's southern defensive line. After more than 250,000 Axis troops were forced to surrender in Tunisia, Eisenhower understood that time was not on the Allies' side. Any hesitation would allow Germany to reorganize its defenses. Sicily, an island commanding the Mediterranean, was therefore chosen as the next objective, both to knock Italy out of the war and to compel Hitler to disperse his forces. On the 9th of July, 1943, from Allied headquarters in the Mediterranean, Eisenhower personally coordinated the largest amphibious landing ever conducted in that theater. Two main forces were committed to the operation: the U.S. 7th Army under Patton and the British 8th Army under Montgomery. The landings began under poor weather conditions, with many airborne units scattered by strong winds and dropped far from their intended positions. Eisenhower, however, refused to allow any delay. He ordered the offensive to maintain its momentum at all costs, relying on overwhelming naval and air superiority to compensate for the initial disarray. As British forces rapidly captured Syracuse and the southeastern part of the island, Eisenhower authorized Patton to expand his advance westward, a decision intended both to exploit tactical opportunities and to keep Patton's drive within the framework of the overall campaign. The result was swift and decisive. Palermo, the largest port in western Sicily, fell to U.S. forces within July, completely shattering the morale of the Italian army on the island. Meanwhile, German forces attempted to organize an orderly defense and gradually withdraw toward the northeast. Eisenhower was not drawn into the temptation of seeking rapid destruction at any cost. Instead, he prioritized sealing the battle space, using air power to cut off escape routes and naval forces to control the Strait of Messina. By mid-August 1943, with Messina captured, all of Sicily was in Allied hands. The campaign ended after 6 weeks, with significant but manageable losses, while most Italian forces collapsed and German units were compelled to withdraw to the mainland. More important than guns and casualties were the political consequences of Husky, which arrived faster than anyone had anticipated. In July 1943, Mussolini was overthrown, the Italian fascist regime collapsed, and Rome began searching for a way out of the war. Despite intense pressure to exploit the moment, Eisenhower firmly upheld the principle of unconditional surrender agreed upon with Roosevelt and Churchill, a decision that allowed Germany time to reinforce Italy, yet at the same time preserved Allied unity. Husky may not have been Eisenhower's most dramatic victory, but it was a crucial test of his ability to command coalition warfare on a grand scale. He demonstrated that he could not only win battles, but also control powerful commanders, manage competing ambitions, and bind the battlefield to long-term political objectives. Immediately after Italy officially declared its withdrawal from the Axis, Eisenhower and the Allied command moved swiftly to seize the opportunity by launching Operation Avalanche, the amphibious landing on the beaches of Salerno in southern Italy, on the 9th of September 1943. Eisenhower understood that the chance to expand the front had emerged, but he also recognized a dangerous reality. The Germans had no intention of abandoning the Italian peninsula. He therefore decided to strike directly at Salerno, aiming to capture the port of Naples and cut off the German withdrawal route from the south to the north. On the 9th of September 1943, as Allied troops came ashore on the narrow beaches around Salerno, Eisenhower closely monitored every report from his headquarters. Under General Mark Clark, the U.S. Fifth Army landed at Vietri and Salerno, while British forces came ashore at Paestum. Eisenhower chose a bold but highly risky approach, limiting preliminary bombardment in order to preserve surprise, while accepting landings in terrain dominated by surrounding high ground, a decision for which he began to pay the price only hours later. Contrary to expectations that German forces would withdraw after Italy's surrender, German armored units immediately counterattacked with ferocity. Panzer tanks and artillery fire poured down from the heights onto the landing beaches, driving many Allied units back toward the water's edge. At one point, Eisenhower faced a rare but very real possibility. The landings could be forced back into the sea. In that situation, he did not order a withdrawal. Instead, Eisenhower directed Allied naval forces to close inshore to an unprecedented degree, using naval gunfire to strike German formations directly, while committing reserve forces and airborne units to hold the beachhead at all costs. As the situation at Salerno reached its most critical point between September 12 and 14, Eisenhower made a key decision. He authorized Allied forces to contract their perimeter and consolidate, rather than attempting to hold positions that were stretched too thin. This decision prevented complete encirclement and bought time until weather conditions improved and Allied air power could return to the battlefield. Once the skies cleared, the balance of firepower shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. Relentless airstrikes and naval bombardments shattered the final German counterattacks, forcing an orderly withdrawal from the Salerno area. By mid-September 1943, Eisenhower could finally breathe easier. The Salerno beachhead held firm, Allied forces advanced into Naples, and a vital foothold on the Italian mainland was secured. The cost was heavy, with thousands of casualties, but the campaign achieved its core strategic objectives. More importantly, Salerno demonstrated Eisenhower's willingness to accept calculated risks, as well as his clarity of judgment in adjusting when events moved beyond initial expectations. Operation Avalanche formally carried the war onto the Italian mainland, compelling Hitler to maintain a long and exhausting defensive front on the peninsula. For Eisenhower, Salerno was a costly but necessary lesson. Victory does not always come from flawless plans, but from the ability to maintain command nerve at the moment when defeat seems imminent. That experience forged the resolve he would need to lead far larger and more brutal campaigns in 1944. All the experience and hard lessons Eisenhower had absorbed during Operation Avalanche were immediately applied to Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings of the 6th of June 1944. This was not only the most important campaign of his career, but also the greatest gamble he would ever take. At the same time, it represented an assault of unprecedented scale to open a second front in Europe, striking directly at the heart of Nazi Germany's power from the west. When President Roosevelt appointed Eisenhower Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe in late 1943, Eisenhower understood that he was being entrusted with more than a single operation. He was being given the authority to decide when to open Europe's door between survival and destruction. If Overlord failed, the Allies would lose hundreds of thousands of troops, the war could drag on for years, and the balance of power in the post-war world might be transformed entirely. From the outset, Eisenhower placed absolute emphasis on preparation. He did not seek a reckless, all-or-nothing blow. Instead, he built a campaign founded on overwhelming superiority. More than 5,000 vessels of all types, hundreds of landing craft, and a vast air force that bombarded Normandy continuously for weeks. Yet Eisenhower also understood that even the most meticulous plans were meaningless if the timing was wrong. In early June 1944, deteriorating weather threatened to derail the entire schedule. Senior commanders hesitated. Eisenhower listened to every argument, and then, in a brief but weighty decision, he gave the order to proceed during the single, fragile window of acceptable weather. In the early hours of June 6, as Allied airborne units dropped behind German lines to seize bridges, road junctions, and radar stations, Eisenhower followed every report with a cold clarity. From this moment on, there was no turning back. At that point, roughly 160,000 Allied soldiers began landing on 5 beaches: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Omaha, the sector Eisenhower feared most, events quickly exceeded the worst expectations. German machine gun and artillery fire from fortified positions on the heights tore into American formations on the sand. Many units were pinned down, and casualties surged within the first hour. From London, Eisenhower received a stream of grim reports, yet he did not order a withdrawal. He understood that if Omaha fell, the entire operation could collapse in a domino effect. Meanwhile, at Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the situation was more favorable. Eisenhower immediately adjusted logistical priorities and fire support, concentrating naval gunfire on the most critical points. His decision to hold to the overall plan, rather than panic and shift objectives on the first day, spared the Allies from strategic chaos. By the end of D-Day, despite suffering roughly 10,000 casualties, the Normandy beachheads remained secure. Eisenhower had prepared a statement accepting full responsibility should the operation fail, but he never had to use it. After D-Day, Overlord did not end. It entered an even more brutal phase. Eisenhower now faced a classic problem of modern warfare: breaking out from the beaches and shattering Germany's deep defensive system. As fighting around Caen and within the dense bocage dragged on in a grinding stalemate, Eisenhower refused to force an advance at any cost. He allowed the tempo to be adjusted, waiting for the right moment to launch Operation Cobra, a massive air-supported breakthrough designed to rupture the German front. That decision tore open the battlefield, enabling U.S. forces to break free from Normandy and rapidly accelerate their advance. The climax of this phase came at the Falaise Pocket, where Eisenhower authorized a north-south pincer movement to close the trap around Germany's 7th Army. More than 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured, a blow that effectively crippled the Wehrmacht's main field force in Western Europe. At the same time, Eisenhower expanded the front by launching Operation Dragoon in southern France, liberating the ports of Toulon and Marseille, and securing a robust supply line for the entire campaign. By the end of August 1944, with Paris liberated and Allied forces crossing the Seine, Eisenhower knew that Overlord had fulfilled its historic mission. The Western Front was firmly established, and Nazi Germany was forced to fight an unwinnable two-front war. This was not merely a military victory, but but a decisive moment that sealed the fate of Europe. And at the center of that moment stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, steadfast through calm judgment, a deep sense of responsibility, and an extraordinary ability to withstand pressure. When the Allied advance in Western Europe seemed irreversible, Adolf Hitler decided to launch his final gamble. In the early hours of the 16th of December 1944, German forces suddenly unleashed Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Ardennes, or the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's objective was clear: to deliver a lightning blow at the heart of the Allied front, smash through the Ardennes sector, split the American armies in two, sever critical supply lines, and, if circumstances allowed, drive the Allies back to the shores of the English Channel. It was a desperate attempt to reverse the course of the war at a moment when Germany had been forced into a comprehensive defensive posture. At that time, Dwight D. Eisenhower served as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. He had deployed relatively thin forces in the Ardennes, a calculated decision, since the region's rugged, forested terrain was considered unsuitable for major operations and was used as a sector for rest and refitting after months of continuous fighting. This very vulnerability was exploited by Hitler. In secrecy, German forces massed a huge concentration of troops concealed beneath the thick winter fog, waiting to strike with surprise during the Christmas season, when Allied vigilance was at its lowest. The attack erupted with ferocity in the early morning. German artillery pounded forward positions, while panzer tanks and infantry surged through the thin defensive lines, throwing Allied forces into confusion during the opening days. Many American units were driven from their positions, and the front line bulged outward dramatically, creating the distinctive bulge that gave the battle its name. At Bastogne, a crucial strategic road junction, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division was completely encircled in bitter cold, short of ammunition and supplies. Faced with the danger of Bastogne falling, Eisenhower immediately made a decisive, turning-point decision. He ordered General George S. Patton, then in Luxembourg, to pivot the entire Third Army northward to relieve the encircled town, a maneuver remarkable for its speed and scale under brutal winter conditions. In the early days, thick cloud cover all but neutralized the Allies' air superiority. Yet Eisenhower held the defensive line with patience, reshaped his dispositions, and committed reserve forces to the most critical sectors. When the skies finally began to clear around December 25, the balance shifted at once. More than 2,000 Allied aircraft took to the air, unleashing devastating strikes against German tank columns, supply depots, and infantry formations that were already stretched thin and running short of fuel. The tight coordination of infantry, armor, and air power quickly shattered the momentum of the German offensive. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes counteroffensive had completely failed. German forces were compelled to withdraw, leaving behind abandoned tanks in the snow and roads littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers. Although the Battle of the Bulge is regarded as the bloodiest engagement for the U.S. Army in the entire Second World War, its strategic consequences were decisive. The fighting in the Ardennes destroyed Hitler's last capacity to launch major counteroffensives on the Western Front. Nazi Germany was forced into a position of total strategic passivity, no longer able to halt the Allies' final advance. More importantly, the victory extinguished any hope of splitting the American and British armies, preserved the unity of the Allied coalition, and opened the path toward the decisive invasion of German territory. After the defeat in the Ardennes, the Third Reich had all but exhausted its remaining resources. No longer capable of mounting large-scale counteroffensives, the German army was forced into a steady retreat under mounting pressure from every direction. At this stage, Dwight D. Eisenhower continued to orchestrate the Allied advance across Western Europe in a systematic manner, merging previously separate thrusts into a continuous front, launching operations to cross the Rhine, the last natural defensive barrier of Germany, and tightening the logistical network to ensure the momentum of the advance was never broken. Under his command, millions of American, British, French, and other Allied troops pushed deep into German territory, steadily suffocating what remained of the Nazi war machine. During this decisive phase, Eisenhower firmly adhered to the agreements reached with the Soviet Union, particularly the decision not to contest Berlin and not to allow American forces to advance beyond the previously agreed lines. Although controversial within Allied ranks, This choice helped avert the risk of direct conflict between former allies in the final hours of the war and ensured that the Western Front concluded in a state of relative stability. When the Nazi leadership was completely paralyzed following Hitler's death, power passed to Admiral Karl Dönitz, and the collapse of Germany became only a matter of time. On the 7th of May 1945, in the city of Reims, France, representatives of the new German government formally signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender in the presence of Allied commanders. The image of Dwight D. Eisenhower standing among British, French, and American military leaders in the room at Reims became a symbol of the collective victory of the anti-fascist alliance, a triumph belonging to no single nation, but the result of coordination and sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. One day later, on the 8th of May, 1945, the war in Europe officially came to an end, closing the bloodiest chapter in the continent's history. As Supreme Commander, Eisenhower successfully coordinated more than 2 million Allied soldiers, bringing the war in Europe to its conclusion while striving to preserve his forces to the greatest extent possible. That victory not only destroyed Hitler's regime and ended the fascist nightmare in Europe, but also ushered in an entirely new world order. From the ashes of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as two opposing superpowers, marking the beginning of the Cold War, an era whose foundations were shaped, in part, by Eisenhower's final decisions in 1945. Looking back at the entire Western Front, it becomes clear that every major campaign commanded by Dwight D. Eisenhower represented an irreversible turning point of the Second World War. The pinnacle of Eisenhower's military career was Operation Overlord, the most illustrious milestone in modern warfare. The Normandy landings were not only the largest military operation in history, but also the moment that sealed the fate of German militarism in Western Europe. And when Hitler launched his final gamble in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge completely buried any remaining hope of reversing Germany's fortunes, marking the irreversible collapse of the Third Reich. What set Eisenhower apart was not a flair for dramatic, personal gambles, but a style of leadership defined by calm, endurance, and an uncompromising sense of responsibility. Without aristocratic origins or the aura of early battlefield glory, he rose through his ability to organize, coordinate, and hold together a coalition of nations with divergent personalities, interests, and ambitions. Eisenhower understood that war was not a stage for personal glory, but a life and death trial in which every decision was bound to the fate of tens of thousands of lives. He was willing to shoulder full responsibility in defeat, yet firm enough to make the hardest choices when victory demanded sacrifice. After the war, Eisenhower's path to power continued to expand. He became the first Supreme Commander of NATO, and later served 2 consecutive terms as President of the United States. Yet beyond all political titles or symbols of authority, history will remember Dwight D. Eisenhower as one of the most successful commanders of the 20th century, the Supreme Commander who led the Allied forces through their darkest hours, secured decisive victories, liberated Europe from the shadow of fascism, and helped shape the world order of the post-war era.